Hi, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to one of my all-time favorite cities, Beirut, Lebanon, to talk with Dr. Saifedean Ammous. He's a visiting scholar at the Center for Capitalism and Society at Columbia University and lecturer in economics at the Lebanese American University. Saif, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thank you for having me, Max.
Your latest piece is called Mubarak's Odious Debts. What is the definition of an odious debt, and how much did Mubarak leave behind?
The definition of odious debt is debt that is incurred by a regime that is not representative of the population it borrows on, whose behalf it borrows on. So if a dictator or if an authoritarian government borrows a lot of money in the name of its people and then uses that money to repress those people or to enrich itself, under international law it used to be that such debt would not be repaid by the successive governments. For some reason, this is not a concept that people talk about a lot anymore these days. And when governments are replaced, it's considered that the successor governments need to honor the obligations of their predecessors. And now is probably a good time to start bringing up this topic and making governments responsible themselves for the debts that they incur and not burden the populations with repaying that debt, especially that debt was used to repress those populations rather than to help them advance or to better their own economic situation.
All right, now during the revolution in Cairo, of course, one of the major talking points, if you will, was to not comply with any IMF debt imposition. Now, several months after the revolution, the IMF and World Bank loan packages are being rumored to being now accepted in Egypt. Your thoughts?
There was a very positive sign after the revolution, which is that the new government, the interim government, particularly the military rulers, decided that they didn't want to take the IMF and the World Bank loans. So it's a positive sign that the Egyptian government turned down these loans. It looks however, they're being mooted to be returning to the IMF and to the World Bank asking for those loans. Nothing has been confirmed yet. There's been various sorts of reports about it in all sorts of different media outlets, but it has not been confirmed yet. But a lot of people are thinking this would be a good thing to do right now because borrowing from the IMF and the World Bank, it comes at a lower interest rate than borrowing from the domestic market. And considering that the budget of the Egyptian government is being strained a lot by how much payments it has to make and by the decrease in tax revenues, this is beginning to look like more of an attractive option for the people in charge of Egypt today. But, you know, it's still not clear what's going to happen because of all the political uncertainty and the economic uncertainty in the country. It's not really clear what this will lead to.
Well, the initial interest rate from the IMF, of course, is the teaser rate. Once they've got their hooks into you, then a lot of bad things tend to happen. Let's talk about the role of corporatism in political and economic unrest, whether in the Arab world or in the rest of the world, for that matter. So the role of corporatism or neoliberalism or the Washington Consensus, do you see much of a future for that, or is this global uprising going to reverse that trend, do you think?
Well, I mean, if you want my opinion about the ultimate underlying economic causes of the revolution in Egypt and in Tunisia, I would think it is the system of corporatism. It's usually people usually talk about, you know, the problem with Egypt and Tunisia was free market capitalism going rampant and going crazy. The problem was that they introduced all those free market reforms with the World Bank and the IMF, and that is what led to all these economic crises. I think that's a quite inaccurate way of putting it, because what Egypt and Tunisia had before the revolutions was by no means a free market system or a capitalist system. It was actually a textbook case of corporatist system. And by a corporatist system, I mean the sort of classic example of that is interwar Italy, Italy under Mussolini between the First and Second World Wars. Under that sort of economic system, you have a government that is very, very, very heavily involved in the workings of the private economy. So it's not like socialism where the capital and the productive enterprises of society are owned by the government. You do have private ownership. However, the government plays a very important role in directing production within that economy. Now, under corporatist systems, what ends up happening is that few powerful interests end up capturing the important positions in the big corporations and in the government. And that was clearly the case in both Egypt and Tunisia leading up to the revolution. The real problem with this is not just that they enrich themselves. You know, obviously that's bad enough that the people like Mubarak and Ben Ali and their associates became very rich. The real problem from this sort of system is that it closes the opportunities in the face of all sorts of normal people in the country to be able to advance economically, to be able to fulfill their potential, to be able to have productive careers and to have good jobs. This is the real problem of corporatism. And I think the problem of Egypt and Tunisia was an economic system that was repressive of the needs of the people in the country. It was an economic system that didn't allow people to reach the potential that they saw for themselves. And I think that's why people revolted. Now, the second part of your question about where this is going, I think it's still really up in the air right now. I'm not entirely sure how things are going to go, but I think there's a positive sign, which is that the clout that the ruling regimes had over economic activity is being softened. They have less control over economic activity than they did before those revolutions. A lot of the most important figures in the corporatist regimes of Tunis and Egypt have either fled the country or they're in prison. So a lot of the ways in which those regimes were able to suppress their people economically are now breaking apart in one way or the other. It's not completely over, obviously. The Tunisian example is going a little bit better than the Egyptian case, but I'm slightly optimistic that things will continue to improve and that totalitarianism will be weakened more and more in Egypt.
All right, so Saif, you're headquartered in Beirut. You just finished up your PhD at Columbia University in New York, so you have a good understanding of what's happening in New York, I would imagine, with the Occupy Wall Street protests, which have modeled themselves on Occupy Tahrir Square, the Cairo uprising. Are these two similar? Where are they not similar? And how would you compare and contrast these two protests?
There are some similarities, but there are also some differences. I think similarities, what I was talking about in terms of the corporatism of the Egyptian and Tunisian economies, I think to a very large extent applies to Western economies as well. If you look at the way the United States government has been acting over the last few years, there's clear evidence that their economic policies have been to the benefit of well-connected firms and banks and to the detriment of the average American. And I think it's also true in the case of Europe. So in that sense, it's good that you're witnessing that people are just not lying down and taking this. That they're standing up and they're rising up. But there are many, many differences, and I think. There are some worrying trends about the way that things are going in Occupy Wall Street and in some of the other European countries, where people you feel are missing the point sometimes when they talk about the importance of redistribution or as they talk about raising taxes as the solution to this. Because if you think that everything is okay with the system, but what needs to be done is just raising the tax rate on the rich people, then I think you have a very big misunderstanding of what the problems really are. It's the question is not about taxing the rich. The question is about taking apart the system that makes some people have the ability to become rich at the expense of others. There's nothing wrong with being rich. There's something wrong with being rich through illicit means or through means where government support or government bailouts were involved in enriching enriching those people. So to focus on raising taxes on rich people, I think is completely missing the point. And the real worrying thing, I think, in Occupy Wall Street, which you're beginning to see over the last few days, is that it is probably going to be co-opted by the mainstream political establishment. So you've already seen people like Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama talk about how they are on the same side with the protesters. And if they're right, and if a lot of the protesters continue to be sympathetic towards the sort of Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama take on things, then you can see this degenerating into something like the Tea Party movement or something like the anti-war movement. Let's remember, back in 2002 and 3 and 4, there was a strong anti-war movement in the U.S., believe it or not. And that anti-war movement is what gave us Barack Obama. He rode the crest of that anti-war movement, but by the time he came into office, he was indistinguishable from George Bush when it came to wars. Similarly, the Tea Party movement is now probably going to give us another presidential candidate who's very similar to Obama and Bush, Rick Perry. So if the Occupy Wall Street movement ends up being co-opted by people like Obama or Pelosi, then obviously it's going to have been a big waste of time. But hopefully something better will come out of it.
to summarize two key points that you're making here, you're making a distinction between corporatism and capitalism, something that a lot of people wish folks like Michael Moore would understand a little bit better in their critiques. You're also saying that it's not a good idea to focus on the distribution or redistribution of wealth per se, but to understand and to focus on the underlying systemic risk and the institutionalized looting that's going on in the system. Now, let me ask you one last question, Saif. You occupy Wall Street. What if you could go down there and write on all their placards just one phrase or one concept to unify them, or you had a chance to manage them down there, what would be your message?
You know, I really don't know. I think I'm not American myself, so I wouldn't want to be presumptuous enough to put myself in a sort of position of to be preaching to Americans about how they need to be fixing their economy.
Yeah, but Saif, let me cut in.
If I was to say one thing, beware of being co-opted.
Saif, let me cut in here for a second, because it's not just an American issue. This is a global issue because the banks are operating in a globalized context, and we've seen what happens in countries like Cairo and Egypt when they become a client state for American banks. And now American banks have run out of poor Egyptians, so they're attacking Americans. So it's a global problem. So your suggestion is don't be co-opted. Is that correct?
Definitely, the most important thing is not to be co-opted into part of the political system, and to learn from the experience of the anti-war movement. And one other thing, as a goal, I think the best thing that could happen to Egypt, Tunisia, Europe, and the U.S. at this point would be complete separation of state and corporations. The states should just completely stop dealing with the big corporations, because it is under the pretext of regulating them and under the pretext of ensuring the safety of their transactions with consumers that governments intervene on behalf of those companies, on behalf of those big companies, and then end up using these interventions in ways that are counterproductive and not helpful to the population. So it's always done under the pretext of looking out for the little guy, but in reality it always ends up causing more problems than it solves, and that's I think the problem of corporatism summarized.
Okay, so separation of corporation and state, and I would imagine one of the first things to do along those lines would to take corporate money out of politics. That's all the time we have. Thanks so much, Saif, for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks for having me, Max.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Saifedean Ammous. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.